Mountains. Grandiose, immovable, and magnificent natural wonders whose heights pierce the clouds like a stairway to heaven reaching towards the starry skies. In many a media portrayal, these behemoths serve as both a literal physical climb that only the bravest dare undertake, let alone reach the top of, and a metaphor for life that echoes the seemingly unattainable goals of the protagonist, no matter what those goals may inevitably be. Reaching its peak affirms that not only can one conquer any challenge thrown along their way, but the sheer beauty of that view once you finally experience it. That feeling of being on top of the world, of seeing how insignificantly small everything around you is, priceless. So what would happen, I wonder, if a video game dared to try and evoke this sense of wonder and awe? A game where almost every single minute movement that the protagonist makes along her excruciating ascent towards the top was in the player's hands. Every piton you place, every tiny crack you find and grip with your hands, every decision you make being the difference between a successful climb and your preemptive demise. Well, you'd get one of the most memorable games I've played in a while, and an early contender for not just my personal favorite indie game of the year, but depending on how the rest of the year pans out, a possible contender for one of my top 5 games of 2026. Cairn's insistence on making Mount Kami both a physical and metaphorical barrier for the protagonist Ava firmly puts the game into a unique territory of its own, separate from every other climbing game I've ever played. Whereas Jusant's mountain proved incredibly important to climb on top of, the gameplay side of things barely reached a level of difficulty that was any higher than climbing a tower in an Assassin's Creed game. On the other hand, Peak's crash landing on a remote island and subsequent climb to the top always felt secondary to the cooperative and fun side of the game. Yet whereas both of these games made the goal of reaching the top a matter of life and death, Cairn presents the mountain as a challenge to overcome, a badge of honor to wear. Ava, the first person to climb Mount Kami after hundreds of previous expeditions failed and potentially died on their journey, the rotten corpses of whom and the messages they left behind still serving as harrowing encounters and a constant reminder of just how difficult and dangerous the act of rock climbing is and what one leaves behind in their pursuit of reaching those staggering heights. But more than just being a badge of honor, Ava finds mountain climbing to be relaxing, invigorating, and potentially one of the few things in life she actually enjoys doing. I would like to make it abundantly clear that most of what I'm talking about here is speculative. The game has a tendency of not spelling anything out for the player, instead it wails in its own ambience and lets the players come to their own conclusions from the bits and pieces of storytelling it provides. How Ava doesn't return any of the messages left by her loved ones. How she seemingly hates her own agent and all the pressure the media puts on her as one of the most acclaimed mountaineers in the game's universe. How even if the player wants to return a message telling her girlfriend that she's okay and alive, the game just doesn't have the option to. There are deeper themes of depression, loneliness, anxiety, freedom, the pressure put on an individual by today's world, and many more throughout this journey if one dares to look below the surface. Yet with how vague and rare all of them are, I think the general consensus, once enough people get to experience and finish the game, will be that Cairn ultimately tells a story where each player will come up with their own separate interpretations on the game's message, ending, and Ava as a character. I'll just say that the moment she decides to completely isolate herself from the outside world, angrily ripping the antenna off her climbbot as she is dangling thousands of feet above any solid horizontal ground, is a moment of pure catharsis that I relate to way too deeply for my own personal good, even if I've never put myself into a situation even remotely as dangerous as hers. There is a plethora of ways that any given game can completely immerse you in its world. While some games go for ultra-realistic graphics, others create some of the deepest and most intricately designed worlds that challenge your worldviews, all the while others attempt to tell a profound and relatable story. Cairn successfully achieves said immersion by making the player be a part of almost every single minute movement that the protagonist Ava makes along her excruciating ascent to the top of Mount Kami. Every limb you move, every piton you place, every tiny crack you manage to find and grip with your toes, every gust of wind you soldier through, and every successful plan and ledge you manage to clamber over feel like a monumental achievement. It is actually shocking to see how much I've learned throughout my multiple journeys to the summit. Whereas my first ascent was littered with almost 100 falls and dozens of deaths, my latter attempt saw me reaching almost 2/3 of the mountain on the hardest difficulty without a single fall. There is a consistent logic to the game's climbing system, one that allowed me to not only reach the summit, but also make one of the most difficult, palm-sweating, and challenging climbs in the game, which left me with such a profound sense of accomplishment that I won't forget for a long time. Holy fuck. This is a completely optional climb that I just did for fun and to see what you get as a reward for reaching one of the guardian statues on the hardest difficulty. I even died here, but it ultimately didn't matter because I loved this experience so much that there might as well have been nothing here and I still wouldn't care. When you begin to come to terms with the logic of climbing and how to best position yourself, the game becomes nothing short of meditative. Despite the player having full control over the movement of Ava's limbs, an attentive eye will spot that even if you make a slight mistake, the game tends to make these minuscule but incredibly important auto-corrections that help tremendously with the game's difficulty and flow state. These essentially serve as corrections so that the player isn't punished for missing the already tiny, pixel-wide gap by just a few pixels, and hence makes the entire experience feel way less frustrating and unfair than it could have been. On the other hand, an attentive ear can very quickly start to notice patterns in Ava's breathing, hear a slide of a foot before even visually noticing it, and even notice her occasional affirmations that she exhales upon a good move. I feel like there are even different sound effects for whether you properly wedge yourself with one of your limbs, but I could be coping and tripping balls here. I tried to test this, but I just couldn't hear a consistent enough pattern. Maybe it's a subconscious thing, or maybe I'm just reaching, whatever. The game does all of the limb selecting for you, which works for about 99.999% of the time, only for it to falter right when you need it to work the most as you watch it pick up the only leg that's holding you upright, with you now tumbling towards the ground because of a faulty calculation. Luckily, the game lets you switch between the game's automatic selection of limbs or your own manual selection with the press of a button, which leads to not only a feeling of unprecedented levels of control over each and every one of your actions, but because the game's background calculations of Ava's grip are so impressively precise, it allows players to just zoom past all the easier sections of the game while trusting the game 100%. Meanwhile, it's better to use the slower, more methodical approach of manually selecting which limb to move for the more difficult parts of the climb. In my own personal experience, you truly do reach a level of trust with this game's systems where you just sit there and go, do you see this tiny crack in the rock face? I now trust this pixel-white thing in a video game with Ava's life more than I trust myself to remember my own damn birthday. This is the level of appreciation and trust you build with this game that, funnily enough, reminds me of Death Stranding and how you can accurately begin to predict the character's movements and sways in that game. Paths that don't seem viable at first glance become a great test of skill and knowledge on return visits. Exploration and experimentation aren't just encouraged, they heavily reward the player with more knowledge of the game's systems naturally, but also tangible in-game rewards like unbreakable pittance, flowers that revive you upon death, maps that show the best routes, and even a bunch of ingredients that can be prepared in a plethora of ways to provide Ava with game-changing buffs that lasts for minutes on end. This system of cooking and mixing different ingredients is especially crucial to master, as it allows the player to have almost unprecedented freedom when climbing towards the summit. That extra grip buff specifically is nothing to scoff at, as it allows Ava to keep her grip even when she has no business staying glued to the side of the mountain. With every other survival element, from taping your fingers one finger at a time to recycling unwanted items to make chalk for more grip, just adding to the game's depth and the overall gameplay loop. Cairn is a game that wants you to not only take it seriously, but to take it slow, methodically, and to always make sure you know exactly what you're doing. It currently even has 3 different difficulty settings, the easiest of which gives 10 safety pittance, a bunch of inventory space, and even allows for rewinds in the event of a fall. Meanwhile, the hardest difficulty makes death permanent with no option to save your progress, no safety pittance to soften your mistakes, and incredibly limited inventory space. This makes it so that no matter the player's skill, basically every person should find a difficulty that suits them, while never really taking away from the tension of climbing a ginormous mountain. And it is because of this exact tension in the climbing sections of the game that some of its more mellow moments work as well as they do. Whether you're watching an aurora borealis with a climber you met along the way, reading the messages left by previous expeditions and hearing their stories, exploring an entire civilization that once lived in these mountains that was ultimately forced to leave and settle in the quote-unquote horizontal world, cooking some ramen while heavy rain pelts your tent, finding the few people that are scattered throughout this mountain, some for monetary purposes, others because they enjoy the solitude and love raising goats, or, you know, having a rave. All of these moments are crucial slowdowns that help tremendously with the pacing. They allow the player to catch their breath and mentally prepare for the next difficult climb, while also adding a layer of depth to the game's world that I really wasn't expecting. If the developer's intent was to design a game that properly showcases both the terror, hardship, and frustration of rock climbing, while counterbalancing all of those with a sense of wonder, awe, accomplishment, and potentially even understanding for why somebody would do something as batshit insane as cling to a bunch of rocks miles above any solid ground, then the best and highest praise I can give to this game is that they absolutely succeeded in doing exactly that. Unfortunately though, I found there to also be a few problems with the game that made it so the experience was a tad bit more frustrating than it should be in my opinion. Starting with the visibility of the game and the logic surrounding what is and isn't a safe place for Ava to stand on, it took me far too long for my liking to understand what is and isn't a safe place to perch on, and I actually still have a bit of trouble with that. Many of the pixel-wide gaps like the one I showed earlier are somehow way safer than many of the ledges that seem wide enough for the protagonist to not just stand on, but also walk across. Granted, I understand that if you look at many of these ledges from the correct perspective, you see that some of them are sloped and would hence lead to a lot of potential slip and falls, but when looking at them from afar, these are usually the ones that are the most visible, most inviting, and hence where most new players will probably move towards, only for the game to occasionally punish them for their choice. What kind of adds a bit of insult to injury to this whole point is the fact that many times absolutely ridiculous poses that see Ava clipping her legs through one another or doing a split that I seriously doubt being a viable solution in real life are actually just the best way to progress in any given situation. It is really difficult to properly test how the grip in this game works because it doesn't allow you to have any less than 3 limbs gripping the wall at any time. But if you've played the game, you know that sometimes putting your entire weight on the tip of your toes while doing some weird pretzel-like position is somehow better than standing on slightly tilted ground, and it just doesn't make sense. The aforementioned 1 in 1,000 times that the game decides to pick the only limb keeping you alive is something that I'd put into the small problems bin, right there with Ava clipping into herself, clipping through the wall, or even the one time I got soft-locked when trying to place a safety piton on essentially the final jump of the game, because at the end of the day, at worst, some of these waste a few minutes of your time, have inbuilt workarounds even if the workarounds themselves aren't perfect, while others just require you to restart the game to unsoftlock yourself, and at best, they're just visual glitches, with the game usually even understanding that you clipped through the floor and teleporting you back to your correct position in a moment's notice. Listen, I'm European, this sort of Eurojank just courses through my veins. Tovarish, ide se, ajmo do... Wow, I have no idea what possessed me there. Kind of how I have no idea what I'm supposed to do at the game's scripted bear encounter. Seriously, this bastard just stunlocks you to death if you're unlucky, and with Ava having the stamina of a sloth whenever she's sprinting, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do here in order to consistently prevent my imminent demise. Not content with just having the stamina of a sloth, Ava takes the personality of said mammal as her own, which works about as often as it doesn't. When she quietly keeps her anger and emotions on her inside, I found it to more often than not make her a deeper character than it first appears on the surface. However, when voicing some of her thoughts out loud, there is just a severe lack of any sort of enthusiasm, joy, and oftentimes even believability. Even a sentence like,
"What we wouldn't do for the people we love,"
is delivered with such monotony when the material is so clearly asking her to be wistful that I don't really understand what the developers were going for in these moments. There also tend to be a few minor frustrations in the parts of the game that don't revolve around the climbing and character interactions. For instance, you can't just eat a granola bar or, well, anything that you find out in the open. You must place it in your inventory first and only then eat it, which is just bizarre. Granted, this limitation may come from the fact that every piece of wrapped food subsequently turns into trash that litters your inventory until you recycle it, so usually if you don't have space for a granola bar, you also wouldn't have space for the plastic wrap that encased it. But this just perfectly leads me to my next point, that being that you also can't just recycle a broken flask or anything you find in the open. You have to first put it in your inventory and only then interact with the item, which all just leads to way too many moments of tedious and unnecessary inventory management. You can already drink water straight from the spring in this game. I really don't understand why I can't just eat something out of a bear-proof box that I found it in. The weather system feels a bit underbaked, with you having to awkwardly pause your game in order to check your barometer that predicts what the weather is going to be in like half a minute or so, yet there was never a time where I felt even remotely inconvenienced by either the rain or wind for that matter. If you're standing on a good foothold, neither of these are ever going to make those unsafe, and if by some chance you have to climb an incredibly difficult part of the mountain with almost no safe holds, the rain usually only lasts for about a minute, and the gusts of wind approach in intervals of like 3 at most, so there's rarely ever a point to the weather, let alone actively checking on it with your equipment. With the final point I'll bring to the table being the fact that I don't think enough upgrades are kept in between playthroughs. For some reason, the strongest item in the game, the Edelweiss, which is a flower that just downright revives you, is something that you bring with you on every expedition after you've acquired it for the first time, yet the unbreakable pittons that are only really useful in a handful of situations, the thermos flask that does something, I think, the little handheld windmill that warns you of gusts of wind, the glow-in-the-dark gloves, are all things that you have to acquire every single climb if you want them. They are fun and helpful additions on a first playthrough, yet every subsequent playthrough, I just ignore collecting any of these, so they might as well just be a part of my kit at this point. Luckily, these few frustrations don't bring my enjoyment of the overall experience down too much. As I said at the beginning, for me, Cairn is a very early contender for not just Indie Game of the Year, but potentially one of my top 5 games of 2026, depending on how the rest of the year pans out. And considering the fact that upon release in early February of 2025, I rated Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 with the same score as I'm about to rate Cairn, thinking that it's 100% going to be my game of the year for 2025, only for like 5 other games to release that year that were at the very least on the same level of enjoyment, if not even higher, I'm going to be a bit more conservative this time round. Cairn is amazing, it has some of the best climbing mechanics of any game ever, it is tremendously enjoyable and incredibly well paced, and while the few issues that I have with it do ultimately leave a bit of a sour taste in my mouth, I believe this game to be an 8 out of 10 experience and a tremendous feat in basically everything it sets out to do.